Today's daf is daf lamed vav, and on the top of the Amud, the Gemara tries to reconcile our Mishnah that says that niklaf is possible. If you peel off the outer peel of an esrog, the esrog is possible, with the sheet of Rav, who seems to assume that when you take off the peel, it's red, and that redness is considered valid. That's kosher for an esrog. So how do we reconcile Rava with our Mishnah? Haba kula, haba miktsasa. So let's try to understand this Gemara according to Rashi and then according to all other Rishonim. Rashi holds that haba kula means if you remove the entire outer peel of the esrog, it's kosher. And the reason for that is because it has this reddish color, which is considered hada. It's considered a beautiful esrog. But if it's only miktsasa, then you have what's called minumar. You have like spots. You know, you've got red here and yellow here, and that's possible. But all other Rishonim interpret this Gemara in the opposite direction. That the miktsasa, if you haven't removed all the peel, that's a reason for the esrog to be kosher. And that's based on an assumption that the esrog could regenerate itself on its own. Whereas if you remove the entire peel, it won't regenerate itself. Now, those words don't sound like they make any sense to you, but it's all based on the sugya we're going to get to later, very quickly. And that sugya compares esrog to a Mishnah in Chulin, which deals with what's called a treifa. And the Mishnah in treifa is going to tell us that if, under certain circumstances, the hide, the outer skin of the animal was removed during its lifetime, let's say as a result of some sort of accident or whatever, then under certain circumstances, we would assume that if essential parts of the animal are still healthy, then the animal could survive, even though its skin was removed. However, if all of the hide was removed, then it is a treifa. So we're going to see, in the light of that comparison between esrog and the laws of treifa, that in a case where the entire peel that surrounds the esrog was removed, it's going to be a treifa, as opposed to the case of menumar, of miktsasa, where although spots of the esrog have been peeled, but since the basic structure of the esrog is still there, then it's not a treifa. So we'll get to that soon, and hopefully that'll shed a light on this Gemara. The Mishnah says, nistak nikev is possible. We're going to have the following cases. We already had the case of niklaf. We removed the skin around the esrog. Now we have a case where you puncture a hole inside the esrog. Let's say you take a needle and you insert the needle into the esrog. That's called nista. Now keep in mind that it's still tam. Remember we said that lekicha tama requires that the esrog be complete. Although there's a puncture in it, but it still is not missing a piece of the esrog. That's a little bit challenging for us, but we have to work with that premise, because otherwise I don't need to disqualify nista or nikev, I should say, if it's missing a piece of the esrog. So we're going to assume that if it's missing a piece of the esrog, that for sure is a psul. And that's not considered a lekicha tama meaning a complete esrog. But here the esrog is complete, but he put a needle through the esrog.
And each two go together?
Nistak is something totally different. Nistak, we're going to cover in a minute, that's a case where there's a split in the esrog, in its natural form. Whereas nistak, nikev, means that he took a needle and he punctured it. On this Mishnah, we have a brisa. And this brisa, Tani, was brought down by Ula bar Chanina. The brisa says that nikev nekev mefulash. If he took a needle and he punctured the esrog through and through, such that the needle comes out on the other side. Then bimashu, I couldn't care less how thin the needle is. There's nothing missing from the esrog, as we said before. But the puncture itself might be minuscule, but it doesn't matter. Once it's mefulash, it went through from one side of the esrog to the other, it's automatically possible. If it's she'eno mefulash, which means that he punctured the esrog, but it didn't go through to the other side. But what happens is that, again, there's nothing missing from the esrog. But what you end up with is an indentation in the esrog. Okay, so again, the subtle differences here. Again, there's nothing missing from the esrog. That would be considered a chisaron of lekicha tama. That's an automatic absolute. Now we're talking about nikev. Nikev means the esrog is whole. It's not missing a piece. However, you puncture the esrog. And here the Mishnah says that there's one case where you puncture the esrog that is automatically possible, no matter what. And that's when it went through from one side of the esrog to the other. That's called mefulash. Now, if it's not mefulash, but on the other hand, it's not chaser, it's not missing a piece, it's been punctured, but it didn't go punctured through and through, then the Brisa says it depends. There was a certain indentation. It's almost like you take an esrog. Imagine you push it with your finger in such a way that there's an indentation in the esrog. Nothing is missing. You didn't take anything out from the esrog. So it's not chassid. But as a result of puncturing the esrog, you created an indentation. Did you go from one side of the esrog to the other? No, it's not mefulash. And here the Brisa says it depends on the size of the indentation. If the indentation is the size of a coin, which is called an isar, probably something similar to like an American dime, something about that size, then even though it's not chassid, and even though it's not mefulash, it's possible. But if it's smaller of an indentation, and the esrog is whole, smaller than an isar, then it's kosher. Okay, now we get to the sugi of trade. Boy, Rav, no do be esrog simone treifa mahu. What if the esrog has something really wrong with it inside? And that's called simone treifa. The word treifa, the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to eat an animal that's a treifa, which means an animal that has some sort of injury to an inner vital organ. And there are 18 categories of treifa. And we're going to be focused on the lungs, which is called the rea or reos. Obviously, the lung is a vital organ because otherwise the animal can't breathe and can't survive. And what happens is that after shechita, we check the inner organs of the animal to see that maybe it was a treifa. We didn't know it was a treifa. In fact, the Gemara has a whole sugya in Chulin. What happens if the animal might have been a treifa exactly where the shechita knife went in, and you can't even check it after you did the shechita, because maybe the shechita itself covers the treifa. But as far as the rea is concerned, there's no relationship between the tsavar of the animal where the shechita takes place and the lungs. Now we're going to see two cases if after the shechita he finds the rea not in its complete, normal, healthy state. And in one case, the Mishnah is going to paskin that the animal's a treifa, in the other it's not. And we're going to take those two cases and find a parallel in esrog where there's some sort of problem and deficiency in the innards of the esrog. Now, I have a picture here of an...
No.
Right, you could know, because what you can see is there's something called a klipa chitzonit, which is the outer, very thin membrane, so to speak, that covers the esrog. And then underneath that, there's a klipa oven, a thicker covering over the esrog. Now, below that, you'll see these two parts of the esrog. You'll see what's called the basar of the esrog, the flesh of the esrog. And then you'll see the chadrei azera, which means these are the components where the seeds of the esrog are to be found. And those chadrei azera are what you'd call the rea, meaning if there's any, that's the vital part of the esrog. If there's any injury to that part, then for sure it's possible. But now the question is, what happens if there's an injury to the outside of the esrog, but there's a flesh, which we call the basar esrog, that separates between the outside and the chadrei azara? So would we assume that the flesh itself is in a sense protecting, that part of the esrog that's critical, which is the chadrei azara? And we have a parallel in terms of the rea of an animal. And again, Rabbi Hosai, we're learning 3 lines in the Gemara, which would take us an hour to learn, but we're doing a daf yomi. So you'll have to, give me the benefit of the doubt. So by Rava, noldu be'esrog simani treifa mao. You have a treifa situation in an esrog. What is the status of the esrog? Should we say that just like the Torah excludes treifa and you're not allowed to eat, so too the Torah invalidates an esrog that's a treifa? My kami boile. The Gemara very innocently asks the following question. You can have 3 situations of a treifa in an esrog, and the Mishnah is outspoken about all 3 cases and invalidates the esrog. I don't need Rava to raise a question about that which is explicit in the Mishnah. Number 1, in niklaf, if you're talking about a case where the entire peel, I'm going according to most Rishonim, the entire peel around the esrog, which we call the klipa chitzonit, was removed, the Mishnah paskins that it's an invalid esrog. And if on the other hand, nistak, if you're talking about a case where the esrog was split open, then once again, the Mishnah paskins that it's possible. In nikav, and we also have a Mishnah that covers the case of nikav. So what is the case about which Rava vacillated? He vacillated a case that's similar in the animal situation to the case of Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. What was the case of Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, where Rabbi Yochanan said that despite the injury and the very unusual circumstances that I discovered with regard to the ray of the lungs, it's still not a treifa. And we're going to try to see maybe that's parallel, has its parallel in esrog, or no, maybe that's a unique halacha with regard to the physical organism and health of an animal. Reya shenishpacha kikiton, we have now a case where after he opens up the animal, after shchita, lo and behold, the lungs are so full of water, right? You remember the disease, water in the lungs, right? So there was so much water that entered into the lungs of the animal that the lungs no longer have any substance to them. They're almost completely liquid. You can pour them like you could pour a keton shel mayim, like you take a flask of water and pour it. That's how wet and soft the lungs have become. And despite that, Rabbi Yochanan says the animal is kosher. It's not a treifa. Why not? So the answer is that although the outside part of the rea protects the rea, and that's called the flesh, you have the bronchial tubes. Now, the bronchial tubes are actually surrounded by 2 different layers of membrane. So I'm reading here a note. He says that the flesh partially dissolved, but the membrane still remains intact. The animal is not a treifa, even though the flesh is so liquidy that it flows from one end to the other. Nevertheless, since it's covered and protected by flesh, it's not considered a treifa. The Omar Rava, and Rava says, "Behu dekaima simpona." You have to add a condition under which Rabbi Yochanan was machshir the animal, and he said it wasn't a treifa, and that is that the bronchial tubes are intact, which means that the animal was protected by the flesh around the bronchial tubes. Again, there are two membranes, and as a result, the bronchial tubes would still be functioning. Obviously, the animal's dead now, but there's no permanent critical injury to the lungs. However, holokaimus imponaha treifa. Rabbi Yochanan would certainly agree that if, as a result of this disfigurement and this very strange situation with the Rhea, you cannot find the bronchial tubes intact, then it's a treifa. Now, Chachamah, what's going to be the deal in a similar case in esrog? Can we say that in esrog, even if the outer membrane has been damaged, but nevertheless, the chadrei azera, which represent the very essence of the life of an esrog, are still maintained intact? Why? Because the flesh, the basar, that separates between the outer layer and peel of the esrog and the chadrei azara is still intact. And just like Rabbi Yochanan said that the flesh that surrounds the bronchial tubes will protect the bronchial tubes, and therefore it's not a treifa, so too can we find a parallel and assume an equation that the flesh of the esrog will protect the pockets of the seeds of the esrog. Well, says Rava, I'm not sure it's a parallel case. Dilma Hasam, there in the case of an animal, with regard to the lungs, hu delo sholid ba'avira, everything that's happening to the animal is internal. And therefore, the negative effects of the air and the atmosphere are not being felt by the lungs because it's internal, it's inside the body. And therefore, the flesh surrounding the tubes of the rhea of the lungs protect the lungs. But in the case of an esrog, we're talking about an esrog that was cut into, and as a result of that, shall we say, injury, siruche masrechet, the inner kishkis, the flesh of the esrog has now been exposed to the air, and that's going to cause siracham. Siracham means rotting. And therefore, we can assume that it's a matter of time before the chadrei azara will rot. And that would make it into a treifa, even though in its parallel case in an animal, Rabbi Yochanan established that it's not treifa. In esrog, says Rabbi, it will be treifa. Dilma, perhaps, lo shna. We can make an exact equation, and we can assume that even in the case of the flesh of the esrog, which is exposed to the air, it still could function to protect the chadrei azara. Tashma, the Gemara says, I can come to a definite conclusion and resolve this issue by quoting a brisa. Esrog tafuach or saruach, etc., etc., we'll get to the whole list, is possible. And the Gemara is going to assume that tafuach and saruach are different types of rotting or decaying of the esrog. In one case, the decaying we'll see is on the outside. In the other case, it's on the inside. And in both cases, the brisa establishes that the esrog is possible, which means that even though the rotting of the esrog and its decay is on the inside of the esrog, it still is possible. And that means that we don't assume, which is one-sided Rava Loshna, that the flesh of the esrog could protect the esrog. Now, there's an entire list. We have kavush and sholok. Kavush means he dipped it in vinegar and let the esrog soak in vinegar for 24 hours. Sholok means he overcooked an esrog. And in all these cases, the esrog loses its beauty. It's no longer hadar and it's possible. Kushi, if the esrog is black, Lavano, it's absolutely white, min numar, or it's got spots around it, possible. Not only that, esrog kikadur possible. If the esrog is perfectly round, that's not a normal growth of an esrog, and it lacks its special beauty of an esrog, and it's possible. Yesh omrim af hatyom. A tyom is when you see two esrogim that merged and became one. They didn't actually merge. That's how the esrog was grown on the tree, but it looks like you took two esrogim and you combined them. And that too is considered a not normal esrog. Esrog habosar, it's very, very small. And here we have Machlokes Shin Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, and Bli Neder will be studying this in depth, so I'm not going to even bother in the time allotment that we have to explain the Machlokas, because the Gemara is going to explain that Machlokas. Idlo b'dfus. Apparently, those who grow esrogim have a certain unique methodology in which they create a mold, and as the esrog is growing, the mold will determine the size and the shape of the esrog. V'aso kimin bria cheretz. As a result of this fus, you end up with an esrog that looks totally different than a normal esrog possible. Why? Because it's not the natural esrog. Later we'll see that there are cases in which he can use the tfus and he changes the shape of the esrog in a way that it beautifies the esrog, but it doesn't undermine the original tzura, the natural shape of an esrog, and it's kosher. In any event, ad kan l'shon habrayso. So the Gemara analyzes, Ktani mias tafuach saruach. We have these rotting, decaying esrogim, which are possible. My love, shouldn't we explain it in the following way? What's the difference between tafuach and saruach? Tafuach mi bachutz, v'saruach mi bifnim. That means that the decaying process was on the outside, the rotting process was on the inside. And we see that on the inside, if there's a rotting process, then the flesh is not able to protect the esrog. It's going to completely dissolve, and therefore it's possible. And that would answer Rava's question. Lo, the Gemara rejects. Idi v'idi v'bachutz. Both cases, we're talking about a rotting and decaying process on the outside of the esrog. Could be that on the inside of the esrog we have the flesh, and if the flesh is at least partially still intact, it will protect the esrog. Below kasha, now you're asking me, so why does the Bryce have both tafuach and saruach if they're identical, and they both are talking about a rotting on the outside of the esrog? And the Gemara answers, ha tafuach afal gav delo sarach, ve'ha de sarach afal gav delo tafach. Tafach means that as a result of the decay, the esrog starts blowing up. Whereas saruach means it's a kind of a bad smell. It's rotting with a bad smell. So the original question of Rava remains a baya de lo ifshita. There's no resolution to Rava's question. Omar Mar, we learned that an esrog kushi possible. If the esrog comes from Ethiopia, it's possible. But Tanya, we have a brisa that contradicts our Mishnah, kushi kosher. An esrog from Ethiopia is kosher. And on the contrary, if it's dom elakuchi, here's the paradox. If it's not a kushi esrog, but it looks like a kushi esrog, it's possible. Why would something that looks like a kushi esrog be possible when the original Ethiopian esrog is kosher? The answer is that the Ethiopian esrog grows in Ethiopia. And there, like the Falasha Jews, they used the Ethiopian esrog that looked black, because that was its natural shape. But here in Eretz Yisrael, if you go out to a paradise and you see a black esrog that's growing, that's not a normal esrog. Here in this part of the tropical world, it doesn't grow black. We don't have that closeness to the equator exactly. Omar Abaye says that that's exactly how we're going to reconcile our Mishnah that invalidates an esrog akushi with this brisa that states that an esrog akushi is kosher. Hitna nami masnisin domel akushi tnan. The Masnis and the Mishnah is talking about a case of an esrog that grew in Eretz Yisrael, and it was black. That's called Dome Lakuchi. That's not a normal esrog. But in Ethiopia, the Mishnah would agree that the Ethiopian esrog, which is the normal local esrog, the indigent esrog would be kosher. Rav offers an alternative reconciliation. Lo kasha, halon, halahu. It doesn't matter where the esrog is growing. It makes no difference. It matters where the esrog is being used, where it's being taken for the mitzvah. If it's in Eretz Yisrael, so then the Mishnah says it's possible. Because as far as the people in Eretz Yisrael is concerned, they're not used to such an esrog, and therefore they don't consider it a beautiful esrog. But in Babylonia, which is a little closer and proximate to Ethiopia, there they're used to, and they import Ethiopian esrogim, and therefore black esrog is considered more or less normal and common. And now we get back to that part of the brisa which I deliberately skipped. Esrog habosar, a very small esrog. Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshir. Amar Rab, Rabbi Akiva of Rabbi Shimon, Amru Davar Echad. We're going to quote a Mishnah in Masechet Masros, which records the Shita of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbah is going to identify Rabbi Shimon in Masros and his ruling with regard to Botzar in Maser, with Rabbi Akiva's ruling in validating an esrog that's Botzar. So if Botzar is potter from Maser, argues Rabbah, which is the Shita of Rabbi Shimon in Masechet Masros, then an esrog is likewise possible for that a Botzar esrog is possible for an esrog, because just like Botzar does not generate a chiyuv maser, it means it cannot be an esrog, and therefore Rabbi Shimon, who says that there's no chiyuv maser in a Botzar esrog, would likewise hold that a Botzar esrog is possible. Rabbi Shimon Ma'igi, what does Rabbi Shimon hold in the Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Masros? Rabbi Shimon poter es hasrogim bekotnon. When the esrogim are in a very small early stage of development, that's called botzar, then there's no chiyuv maser. And the Gemara is now assuming that according to the Tanakama of Rav Shimon, there is a chiyuv maser because the esrogim, even though they're very small, they are still edible. And Rabbi Shimon holds that if the esrog is very small, then it's not called a pri. And therefore, when the Torah says that you have to be mafresh maser, it's from a pri. And this is not a pri, although it's edible, and Rabbi Shimon doesn't deny that, but it's not developed enough to be considered a pri. The Gemara therefore assumes that when the Torah says that on Succah I have to take a pre-Eitz Hadar, Rabbi Shimon would argue that a Bosar Esog is possible because it's not a pre. The Tanakama, on the other hand, holds that Bosar is Chayv and Maser because it's edible. And that would be enough in the Gemara's Havamina to be Machshir the Esog for the Daled Minim. Amalei Abaye says to Rabbah, Dil Maloi. There's no reason to make these two issues interdependent. They are independent, they're not interdependent. Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Akiva hacha. When we talk about esrog, there we have a requirement of hadar. The Torah describes it as it creates hadar. It very well could be that Rabbi Akiva would concede that an esrog of bosar is in fact a pri, and therefore he would hold like the Chachamim that an esrog of bosar generates a chiyuv maser against Rabbi Shimon. However, Rabbi Akiva invalidates an esrog of bosar for the mitzvah of Daled Minim because be'inon hadar v'lek, it's not enough just to call it a pri. The Torah calls it a pre-eitz hadar, and this is not hadar. It's both. It's very early in its development. It hasn't beautified. But as far as the chiyuv maser, he can accept the sheet of the Chachamim. Then insofar as Boser has a Shem Pri, it generates a Chiyuv Maser. Inami, and I think the Inami here is the flip side, meaning now I showed you that Rabbi Akiva is free to accept the Tanakama. I want to show you that Rabbi Shimon is free to reject Rabbi Akiva. Inami, I can look on Rabbi Shimon also. Why does Rabbi Shimon exempt an esrog of Bosar from Maser? That's because the Ksiv Aser Taser is called Tvuas Zaracha. The Torah in Parshas Re'eh tells you that you need Tvuas Zaracha for the Chiyuv of Maser. What does that mean? Tvuas Zaracha. Kederech Shbnei Adam Motziim Lizriya. That which farmers would take out to the fields, and they would produce, by planting them, they would produce more seeds. But in the case of Bosar, it's so premature in its development that if you were to plant it in the field, it would not produce. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon excludes Bosar from Maser. But as far as Esrog is concerned, it's very possible that Rabbi Shimon will reject Rabbi Akiva's psul, accept the opinion of the Chachamim, and hold that even though we have a very early stage esrog, which is called bosar, and if you planted it, you would not grow a tree, but nevertheless, it's beautiful enough so that it's valid for an esrog. And the Gemara concludes with sulamid. Sulamid means finito. That's the end of the story. Abai is absolutely correct. There's no way you can make this interdependence between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon. The Mishnah says, actually it was the Brisa, I'm sorry. Gidlo b'tfus, he was able to use this mechanical way of growing an esrog by putting it in a mold. Vasan kamin birya cheres, and now it grows as a very distorted esrog. Possible. Omar Rava lo shano elad kamin birya cheres. If it looks like a different creature. Aval kibriyaso, if it looks like an esrog, it's kosher. So the Gemara asks Shita. After all, the Brisa only disqualifies it because it's kamin birya cheres. Tanina, that's what it says explicitly. Rava doesn't have to read the Brisa for me. Lo tzricha davidi dapi dapi. Okay, what's dapi dapi? So Rashi here says that dapi dapi, very complicated. Okay.
Planks.
Planks. Okay, that's the translation.